By now, I hope you've all looked at the first part of the PowerPoint that I put online, and also taken a quick glance at the resource website that I posted, and looked through some of the major ideas about gender trouble. I can't emphasize enough how much I think it's important to try to grasp part of gender trouble really before you start into bodies that matter. This was prepared by Mary Klages, who's an associate professor in the English department at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I've adapted her comments. They are available on the website, on her website, which I give the link to in one of my PowerPoints. She starts, as I suggested we do in residency regarding all categories, by asking questions about the category woman. Who does it include, and how do we know who it includes? And who decides what's in this category anyway? These questions probably sound very familiar. As my previous comments have indicated, the feminist theory that categorized second-wave feminism of the 1960s and 70s used, for the most part, the identity woman as a universal category, particularly in the Anglo-American tradition. And, however, exceptions emerged from this categorization of second-wave feminists, and objections to the notion of the universal category woman often came from the margins. Women, for whom any essentializing category did not quite fit, particularly women of color, working-class women, and lesbians. So, both psychoanalytic and mainstream feminist theory relied on this notion of woman as referring to an essence, in fact, a biological given, a universal. Butler emerges on the scene, importantly, after many of these objections have already been raised. So it's not like she invented all of this out of thin air. Her work, as I've noted, emerges almost from an absence. If we cannot speak of woman as a universal category, how do we speak of woman at all? And moreover, how is a political movement such as feminism able to stake its claims around such a ragged signifying identity? Butler's approach is to assert that woman is multiple and a discontinuous series of meanings, not a static category, with what she calls ontological integrity. She does so, in part, by using psychoanalysis, a grand narrative, to illustrate just how woman, as a unitary category, is formed. Psychoanalysis is a story about origins and ends. So the grand narrative concept, a beginning and an end, which includes some things and leaves out others. The story starts with utopian non-differentiation of the sexes, which is ended by an enforced separation and the creation of difference. This is the story of Freudian psychoanalysis in particular. As Butler notes, this narrative, quote, gives a false sense of legitimacy and universality to a culturally specific, and in some cases, culturally oppressive version of gender identity. In a way, Butler is asking the question about what happens in a psychoanalytic paradigm if you don't have a mom and dad and no one else. If you're raised by a single parent, or two parents of the same sex, or a grandmother. She looks at how the Freudian grand narrative privileges a certain story, a certain pattern of identifications that supposedly produce a coherent, unified, gendered self. Man, woman, masculine, feminine. And says, no, that's not really how it works. You could have variations, fragmented identities, discontinuous or provisional understandings of our gender identities based on a wider variety of identifications beyond just mother, father, and child. So Freud had set up a system where certain identifications are primary in forming a gendered self, and others are secondary. The primary identifications have more power to shape a self than the secondary ones, and are subordinated or subsumed within the primary ones. Hence, relationships with the mother are primary for both sexes, while relations with siblings, for example, are secondary, not as important in the narrative of how the gendered self is formed. The primary-secondary identifications are temporal. The primary ones happen first, the secondary are added on. Without that temporal placement, first this, then that, you couldn't tell which identifications were more important than others, which were substance and which were attributes, if you will. If we could redesign the Oedipal narrative so that it wasn't linear and temporal, we'd have all the identifications going on at once, or without ranking, so that all would be equally important, all would be attributes, without one being substances. Butler, so that's part of what Butler is questioning. She then presents the idea that the concept of the unconscious makes any idea of coherence or unity suspect. Whether we're talking about a slip of the tongue or any narrative story, including a grand narrative of psychoanalysis. Freud's story works hard to be unitary and coherent, to tell a connected story about how gender is formed. It does so by repressing certain elements, excluding them from the story. One of the ways it achieves this is to repress or exclude ideas of simultaneity and multiplicity in gender and sexual identity. According to Freud, you either identify with a sex or you desire it. Only those two relations are possible. Thus, it's not possible to desire the sex you identify with. If you are a man desiring another man, for instance, Freud would say that's because you really identify with women. Butler looks at how Freud tells the story of how fantasy identifications, that is, identifications that happen in the unconscious, shape our identity. This is going back to the point that the unconscious sort of belies any notion of coherence or unity. When we identify with someone else, we create an internal image of that person, or more precisely, who we want that person to be. And then we identify with that internalized and idealized image. Our own identity, then, isn't modeled on actual others, but on our image of their image, on what we want the other to be, rather than what the other really is. Gender, then, as the identification with one sex or one object, like the mother, is a fantasy, a set of internalized images, and not a set of properties governed by the body and its organ configuration. Rather, gender is a set of signs, internalized, psychically imposed on the body and on one's psychic sense of identity. Gender, Butler concludes, is thus not a primary category, but an attribute, a set of secondary narrative effects. Gender is thus a fantasy enacted by corporeal styles that constitute bodily significations. It's a quotation. In other words, gender is an act, a performance, a set of manipulated codes, costumes, rather than a core aspect of essential identity. Butler's main metaphor for this is drag, dressing like a person of the opposite sex. All gender is a form of drag, according to Butler. There is no real core gender to refer to. Butler has often been misused, misquoted, or misunderstood as talking about performance in any kind of dramatic sense, and drag as a drag performance, literally as men dressing as women or women dressing as men and performing on stage. Professor Klages uses drag to, and says it's a metaphor. I would go further. Drag is not only a metaphor. I think it's a metaphor, but it's also, there's an element of materiality to it. There's an element of wanting to push the limits of how we think of drag and how we think of gender and how we all drag all the time. And I don't think she intends it as purely metaphor. That's all I would add.